Hello and welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, support for British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party is plummeting after a series of scandals. The latest allegation of misconduct surrounds a Christmas party by his staff at the peak of a Tier 3 COVID lockdown last year. Now, his spokesperson has stepped down over the controversy, but the British public seem to want more, maybe even Johnson's resignation. But some analysts ask, how is that the holding of an illegal Christmas party will cause more outrage from the British public than their government's support for killing civilians in places like Yemen and Palestine? Is there a problem here with the overall moral compass? Stay with us as we take a look at all of this on the Spotlight.
Back-to-back scandals are taking their toll on the popularity of British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his ruling Conservative Party. An opinion poll shows support for Conservatives is down 4 points to 32%. That gives the opposition Labour Party a 9-point lead, their largest since 2014. Johnson's own ratings are also at their lowest since his party won a landslide in 2019. His popularity is 14% down in 2 weeks. A video was leaked this week showing Downing Street staffers joking about a Christmas party held there last December, while the country was under COVID lockdown. The scandal has already led to the resignation of Johnson's spokeswoman, Allegra Stratton.
My remarks seemed to make light of the rules that people were doing everything to obey. That was never my intention. I will regret those remarks for the rest of my days, and I offer my profound apologies to all of you at home for them.
The British Prime Minister has denied that there was a party and apologised for the video.
I apologise for the impression that has been given that staff in Downing Street take this less than seriously. I'm sickened myself and furious about that.
While the leaked video was the talk of town, reports came out about 2 more lockdown gatherings at the Downing Street, including one at Johnson's own flat. A probe is now underway into whether the parties broke COVID rules. The Premier is facing calls to step down.
Downing Street willfully broke the rules and mocked the sacrifices we have all made, shattering the public's trust. The Prime Minister has a duty, the only right and moral choice left to him. It is for his resignation.
Labour leader Keir Starmer is strongly critical of Johnson too.
But there's also this basic question of trust, and that is broken with the Prime Minister, and that's why he is unfit for office.
In recent months, the British Prime Minister has faced criticism over other issues, including his handling of a sleaze scandal, the awarding of lucrative COVID contracts, and the refurbishment of his Downing Street flat. That's beside revelations Johnson intervened to evacuate pets from Kabul during the chaotic Afghan withdrawal in August. Now the latest scandal involving the lockdown parties may be the final nail in the coffin as Johnson's popularity continues to plummet. More than half of those taking part in the latest opinion poll believe that the Premier should step down.
I'd like to welcome my guests to this Spotlight. Tony Gosselin, historian and investigative journalist out of Bristol. And Fra Hughes, journalist and political analyst out of Belfast. Welcome both of you to the program. Let's start this off in Bristol. And Tony, your take on the overall reaction of the British public and dealing with this Christmas party scandal.
Well, look, Marcia, he's gone from hero to zero, hasn't he? The man who could get Brexit done, and now he's plummeting in the polls. But there's 2 important aspects to this that haven't really been covered, I don't think, anywhere near enough. One of them is if Boris Johnson is to go, who is going to replace him? And I think we always got to look at the man standing in the shadows behind the curtain. And that would almost certainly be Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, who is very much a creature of the City of London. He's a former employee of some of the big financial institutions, and that would, of course, put them in the driving seat rather than the Conservative Party as a whole. So, we need to look carefully at, maybe what's going on here. If Boris is going to be moved out of the way, who is going to be taking his place? Very important, and people often forget that. It's very easy to throw mud at whoever's in power. And what we often forget is that actually maybe they are just put there in power by some more powerful forces behind the scenes. I think that's mostly the case in Western politics anyway. The other thing is that this seems to have all happened because Boris has instituted this thing called Plan B a fortnight or so ago. And there's been increasing calls from all sides for him to go because of this. Now, this is as a massive overreaction, in my view, to the Omicron variant. Now, some have called this Omicron variant a gift from God, because what it does is it enables people to become immune after catching it, and it's very unlikely that anyone will die of it. It's a very mild version of the disease. So rather than embracing this, this has been jumped on as a terrible, terrible thing. And I think there's many people on all sides of the political spectrum, and particularly in the press, who feel that, what Johnson's done by overreacting to this and following along with some of the alarmist speculation about the tens of thousands of deaths and hospitalisations that may result from something which the South Africans tell us is very mild, is also related to this. So, I think it's clear that the press is leading this. And also, I think, whereabouts have these leaks come from, these leaks about the party? Let's look at the facts. So the party that Boris Johnson is alleged to have presided over, he wasn't at that party and he took no part in it. So it's quite feasible that it was arranged by somebody who was at Downing Street, like his chief of staff, etc., behind his back. And I think that's not impossible, although, of course, he may well have known about it. And certainly the police who would guard 10 Downing Street would certainly have known about it. So it's very strange that they didn't act at the time. There are actually a lot of prosecutions going through in Britain still right now of ordinary people like you and I that were caught having apparently illegal parties at this time of year. Why not the top people? So the police have got a lot of questions to answer too on that occasion. So okay. I think, what I'm trying to do, Marcia, is trying to get behind this, because I'm a little bit concerned when I see the press all going at the same time. And I'm also always very, very aware of, if Boris is moved out of the way, who's going to take over and what influences do they represent?
Okay. All right. Well, let me get in on this conversation. Many say that the public's upset because they feel that Johnson lied. At least, as Tony says, that's exactly what's being talked about in the press. But, it wasn't like he was known to be an honest person before he was elected as Prime Minister, from his extramarital affairs to so many other situations, whether we're talking about Brexit, are other lies that he has been known to tell. So, what is it that all of a sudden, as Tony has said, there seems to be an unbelievable reaction when you didn't elect an honest person to begin with. Why such an uproar, thinking that maybe he lied now? What is this really about in your perspective?
Well, I would have to say it's possible that there's some form of a political coup going on in the background. If you remember that this actual accusation about the party in Downing Street was nearly 12 months ago. So obviously this evidence, this videotape, this recording has been in someone's hands for 12 months before it's been put out into the public domain. So it's possible there's a political coup in the background orchestrated by other members of the Conservative Party, indeed maybe frontbench members of the Conservative Party who want to oust Johnson in favour of a new leader. That said, it was only in 2019 that Boris Johnson was denying accusations that he burnt a £50 note in front of a homeless person when he was a student many years ago in London. I think we should bear in mind that there have been scandals all the way through his premiership. We had the Dominic Cummings affair, and then we had Neil Ferguson resign as senior analyst with the government. Boris Johnson has a track record of being a bit of a bluffer and a blagger, and he's someone who talked himself into power and talks himself out of trouble. I don't think Johnson will actually go anywhere. There's an 80-seat majority for the Conservative Party within the British Parliament. He's probably in a stronger position than any party political leader has been in decades. And I think it's very important for Boris Johnson that having such a large majority in the House, and there is no election planned before May 2024, I think he will just ride this out the same way he has done with every other political scandal in his career to date.
But Tony, Labour leader there is saying it's a problem, basic question of trust. And again, I mean, we look at this and it's almost comical, I guess, unfortunately, when we hear politicians talk about trust, but especially, again, Boris Johnson and his given record. It just seems, as you already mentioned, there seems to be political maneuvering out of this. That someone is trying to get to something else, of course, with the cover of this Christmas party. I mean, as you said, you're a journalist, so especially journalists know that when the mainstream media makes a big deal out of something, you better look behind it and see exactly what's going on. So you talked about some of the possibilities of the political maneuvering taking place here. Where do you see this going exactly? Do you think, opposite from our guest in Belfast, that it could actually cause the fall of Johnson or not?
Well, yes. I mean, I think I do, because first of all, I'll say it was just over a year ago. All these so-called parties, etc., and now the things we've seen as evidence parties happened about a year ago. But it was just before that, the resignation of Dominic Cummings behind the scenes. Now, he was the chief of staff at Downing Street, and he's a very Machiavellian character. He brags about reading Sun Tzu's Art of War and The Prince by Machiavelli. These kind of it doesn't seem as if he was in there to do a good job for the public. He was there to do political manoeuvring. It may well be him that's spearheaded the release of these various leaks at this particular time. And this is one of the things that happens, I think, I'm afraid, in journalism too, is that journalists and editors will hang on to stuff for a long time in order to use it to threaten and eventually maybe use it to manoeuvre out a specific individual, in this case Boris Johnson. Now, there's another aspect to this, and that is there's something in the Conservative Party called the 1922 Committee, and this is a big, powerful committee of backbenchers, people who are not involved in the government. In other words, they're not on Boris's payroll, but what they can do is they can order a vote of the membership of the Parliamentary Party and of the whole Conservative Party of confidence in Boris. So even though Boris has got a big majority in the Houses of Parliament, it may be his own party can unseat him and replace him, even though he's in that position. So that is entirely possible. But I think it's also fascinating and very important, you mentioned yourself, the killing of civilians in Yemen and places like this, because, of course, all this gets drowned out in the distraction of what's going on at Westminster, which is effectively its internal Conservative Party manoeuvrings, I think, that's going on. And it's not helped by the fact that the Labour Party is, in fact, next Tuesday, on Tuesday this coming week, the Labour Party is due to vote with Boris, supporting Boris, in the stricter COVID measures he's trying to bring in, whereas many of his own party are revolting against him. Well, what this means is that the Labour Party, the opposition party in Britain, could potentially bring down the government voting against it and embarrass it, but it's choosing to vote with Boris instead. So there's a 40, 50, 60 backbenchers Conservatives about to vote against Boris Johnson, and Labour could have voted with them and made it very, very difficult for Boris to continue and to have any credibility. They have chosen. So what I'm saying is the real opposition politically in the Houses of Parliament, in the House of Commons today, is the Conservative Party, and that is an extraordinary position to be in the country. So distraction away from these wars abroad, I think you're absolutely right to point that out. This is still carrying on with British military facilities being moved over to Saudi Arabia to aid this bombing of Yemen, etc., which is continuing to this day. I think that these are the sorts of issues get drowned out. What I'd like to see is some real, genuine leadership in the country, and also some genuine attitudes from the press in right across the Western world in calling out some of this horrifically amoral, immoral, attempts to manoeuvre, particularly in the Middle East. And of course, we've had the appalling news about the injustices to Julian Assange, which Boris Johnson himself doesn't seem to have mentioned once, even though it's one of the most important court cases ever to take place on the planet, which is taking place right now in London. Boris has nothing to say about that, and that's another reason why he's losing support fast. Okay,
well, turning back to Belfast, I mean, your perspective, Tony just mentioned, for example, Assange, and I want to look at that situation, that we don't see that type of outrage one would see coming out of the British public. And again, I go back to London's support for repressive regimes, whether we're talking about Israel or Saudi Arabia, or we're talking about Bahrain, that they're giving these weapons to these repressive regimes and supporting them in so many different ways. And yet nothing is said. Is it because the British public, the public is not informed? Is it that they don't care, or is it the role of the media? How do you assess this overall?
Well, I think what you've asked is a very, very, very interesting question. If we stick with Julian for just 1 second, his exposure of the Afghan warlogs was what brought him to the attention and WikiLeaks of the world public. He exposed war crimes carried out by America, done in the name of the American people. Part of the propaganda war that's preceded nearly everything that's happened with these humanitarian interventions throughout the world on behalf of Britain, NATO, America, mainly at the behest and in favour of strengthening Israel's position within the region by attacking strong anti-Zionist governments that stand with and beside the Palestinian people. So Julian is suffering from the revenge of the American administration for him showing the world what America is doing in the name of democracy and these humanitarian interventions. I think that Britain is completely complicit in the war crimes that are carried out within West Asia and the Middle East. I don't think that some people who claim Britain are the lapdogs of America and have somehow, bowed down to American demands to have Julian Assange extradited. I think Keir Starmer's, who was involved in the original prosecution, I believe Boris Johnson and the whole British establishment are more than happy to see Julian Assange face 175 years in the darkest, deepest hole that they can find in the American penal system. So Britain is complicit and has always been complicit in its own colonial history and in its present bombing of Yemen, probably secret attacks in Syria, the destruction of Libya. They are all birds of a feather, these neoliberal, colonial, quasi-imperialist, capitalist governments that are there to demonize and to extract resources from the southern hemisphere to come to the northern hemisphere. And I believe that the reason, it's quite possible that a lot of this is just pure distraction from the debacle of Brexit, from Julian's extradition, from everything that else is happening. It could be smoke and mirrors. Look over here as a distraction while we continue to bomb, maim and terrorize people throughout the globe.
Well, Tony, it just seems that there is a lack of any type of moral compass in British politics. It just seems that it's money, it's economics over morality. I mean, your perspective on that and the effect of that type of mentality and those who are ruling the country, the effect that it has overall.
Well, look, I want to reassure you, Marcia, it's actually not all over British politics. There is actually a very important faction in both of the main political parties, which does have a moral compass. It's just that the way the system works is that the Prime Minister will recruit yes men. And I would say actually what he's dealing with is a dwindling supply of them into the cabinet. I mean, for example, we've got, a Home Secretary, Priti Patel, who was involved in all these secret meetings with the Israeli government. And yet she was invited back in, even though she'd broke the ministerial code when she was International Development Secretary. She was presiding over a massive assault against a vigil in the city, in the centre of London on Clapham Common, and yet she suffered no penalty because of that. I think Boris Johnson is paying the price of sticking with this small coterie of amoral Conservative MPs who he's managed to recruit into the cabinet. But there is, as I said, quite a force out there within the backbenchers in the Parliamentary Conservative Party who are getting increasing. They're looking at the numbers of MPs who are pro-Boris and anti-Boris, and also the numbers of members of the Conservative Party, and they're realising they're getting to the point where maybe they can just unseat Boris and replace him with somebody else. And quite who that, I mean, that, like I said, it may be Rishi Sunak. But I think we also need to look, when we're looking at the perspective of all these sometimes incomprehensible wars that are going on in the Middle East, the British and the Americans particularly have been supporting, that there is a long-term plan, first during the Second World War, to institute the State of Israel, and secondly to create a war in order to discredit all the three main monotheistic faiths. And this, I think, has been ongoing for a long time, and many people haven't actually seen that this is an attempt to actually, I mean, people say, like my own family, I talk to them and they say, well, no one wants a war. Well, actually, some people do. For these sort of spiritual and ideological reasons, they want to have a war to discredit these faiths, and they also want to have that war to make a lot of money. And so the only forces we've got are within the House of Commons, the people who are not in the key positions in Keir Starmer or Boris Johnson's cabinets, you know, the shadow cabinet Starmer's got. And those are the people, I think, that may make a difference here.
Okay.
And it's very important that we keep a very close eye on what these backbenchers are up to, because they will decide Boris's fate.
All right. And for 1 minute, where do you see all of this going in and affecting British politics? Your assessment overall?
Well, I think there was a very interesting poll that came out recently, a YouGov poll on how politicians act in power and why they are there. 5% of the respondents said that politicians were there to work on behalf of the public, and 63% of the respondents said the politicians were there to promote themselves. So what we have are millionaires and billionaires in an elite clique within the political structures that govern the country, and people like ourselves see them for what they are. They are people who are self-promoters and are using politics in order to line their own pockets.
And on that note, I thank both of you for being with me on this spotlight. Out of Bristol, historian and investigative journalist Tony Gosling, and out of Belfast, Fra Hughes, journalist and political analyst. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another spotlight. Make sure you join us right here next time. I'm Marzieh Hashemi, signing off for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Goodbye.